Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, June 12th, and we're going to start talking a little bit about Charlie Baker. He had some comments about the new House settlement that just dropped that I want to get into with you guys. Definitely some interesting things from the NCAA President there. Then we'll get into Jim Harbaugh and Sherrone Moore. It sounds like Jim Harbaugh had a very, very strong promise to Sherrone Moore sometime in the last 2 years when he was talking about the head coaching job at Michigan. So I want to break that down, how it kind of adds to what Sherrone Moore is dealing with this upcoming year. Then we'll get into the Big 12. We've been doing the SEC and the Big 10 the last couple of days. We'll get into Big 12 win totals. We'll also get into Big 12 Cinderellas throughout the show. And then at the very end, we will get into Wednesday what ifs, kind of a new segment around here where we'll break down what ifs from the past, the present, the future for college football, and what it would mean for college football. So definitely a fun segment there. Definitely stick around for that. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. But let's jump right in, and let's start talking about Charlie Baker. The NCAA president finally had spoken publicly about the House settlement that went over probably about a month, maybe 3 weeks ago. So it's been a crazy couple of weeks. It's definitely been a lot to kind of wrap your head around and get to a place where you fully understand everything. And I think the people that even passed it don't fully understand what they, have fully done here, because there are some consequences that will come down the road. But it sounds like when Charlie Baker was officially announced as the NCAA president in December of 2022, he was asked very clearly, just do something. The current state of college sports is not in the place that it needs to be, and we got to move forward somehow. And he did exactly that. I think the House settlement obviously is a huge step forward. In my opinion, it's probably the biggest thing that's happened in the last 20, 25 years, maybe in the history of college sports, just because it totally changes the way that we look at it. It totally changes the way that it operates, the pay structure for the athletes, everything in between is totally different now because of this settlement. And it seems like something that Charlie Baker is really proud of. Obviously, you wanted to get some of those court cases off your desk, although I don't necessarily think it saves them too much in the future, but it does, get a ton of stuff off their plate and move them forward at least a little bit into solving these problems and getting to a place where everyone knows the rules, we have common sense rules, and everything kind of works the way that a lot of us have been waiting for quite some time for it to work. But I think there's a ton of questions around this new House settlement, and he really thinks the same. He was very, very open about the idea that there are some huge hurdles ahead of them with Title IX, with how this pay structure is going to be split up. Obviously, there is a huge leaning to college football, to college basketball, but there are tons of other sports that need to be funded in some way or the other. So it'll be fascinating to watch how that kind of unfolds. I don't know how it's going to be applied. It sounds like Title IX might not be applied in this scenario, which would not be very good for some different sports out there. But it'll be very interesting to see what happens. It'll be fascinating to see if, it's more scholarships going towards the smaller sports, if it's, some NIL money being pushed in that direction, whatever that looks like. You got to bridge that gap somehow, likely. So it'll be really interesting to see how that goes. It'll be fascinating to see, if there's anything that kind of comes of that. One of the big thing that we've talked about a lot on here, and he talked about, was the employee-employer structure that people have thought about for quite some time in college sports, making this a fully above board system. They're employees of the school or the conference, and that's just kind of it. He didn't sound very enthused by that idea, and it sounds like not a lot of people are in general. In fact, one of the, I believe a bill was introduced recently, maybe yesterday actually, that would basically bar any employee-employer relationship in the NCAA happening. So it would be very interesting. There's no two ways about that. But there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen. There's, maybe collective bargaining in the future. Maybe players aren't even employees, but they still have to collectively bargain and figure out what the best way forward is for them. So there's tons of dominoes still to fall. And Baker seems to be very confident that all of this, settlement and everything is going to get approved and put through. It sounds like fall 2025 is the taking off point, I suppose, for this new kind of world that we're getting into. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens up until that point. Claudia Wilkin is the U.S. District Judge that's overseeing this, and she's overseen a ton of big antitrust cases in the NCAA. So she's definitely well-versed in this issue, definitely knows what needs to be in the law, what doesn't need to be. So it'll be very interesting to see kind of how that unfolds. But Baker really hadn't spoken too much about this settlement since it's happened, really. So it was definitely really interesting to see what he thought about kind of what was coming down the road, how were they were going to kind of deal with some of the different problems that were going to come up from this. And one of the things that seemed very interesting to me, that I don't know if it came across the same way to everyone, but to me it seemed very confident that he was not going to have to deal with a lot of these going forward. Now, I don't think he's necessarily naive enough to think that people aren't thinking about it or players aren't talking about it, because this settlement really only goes through 2016, excuse me. So anyone before that, I would be very surprised if there were not a couple athletes that were calling their lawyers, seeing what a attack on the NCAA would look like, seeing if they could get a little bit of money in this process. So it'll be fascinating to watch if more of these pop up, because the reality is the NCAA is currently fighting an uphill battle. They don't have a ton of enforceable rules. They don't have a ton of power over a lot of the big-time universities out there, whether you're the Group of Five, Power Five. It honestly doesn't all that matter. The NCAA is relatively ineffectual right this second, and the best way for them to move forward, really the only way for them to move forward, is without a bunch of court cases on their desks. If they have to deal with this going forward, then we're likely going to see college football, college basketball, some of the different entities in this, in college sports start to break off and be their own thing. And it'd be really hard to blame them, if we're being totally honest, just because the way things are working right now is not necessarily the way they're supposed to. And especially if, more court cases come on the table and they have even less time to try to figure out what the future looks like and have more time to focus on what the past was and how to kind of right the wrongs of the past, you're going to get impatient. If you're the SEC, if you're the Big Ten, if you're college football in general, you're going to get relatively impatient. There's almost no two ways about that. It's going to be fascinating to watch, how quickly that happens and, how many court cases come on the table before all of this kind of goes crazy. But the reality is there's so many things that need to happen. And Charlie Baker, Greg Sankey, Tony Petitti, whoever it is, the powers that be in the sport have to get their ducks in a row, and they have to be relatively proactive in doing so. This doesn't kick in until fall of 2025. There's tons of things that can happen before that to make this a smoother landing. It's going to be weird, it's going to be different, and it's going to be a lot of things that we're just going to have to, turn over that rock to figure out what's on the other side. But the reality is this sport is going to be different. Fundamentally, all of college sports are going to be different fundamentally, and Charlie Baker has a lot to do with that. And frankly, I've said this a number of times before on here. I've said this essentially any time that I've talked about this. This was probably a necessary step. It's obviously, not the way that we wanted to go about this, with it being a huge court case and being kind of messy and a little bit rushed, in my opinion. But the reality is this was something that probably had to happen. It's been far too long where college football, basketball, softball, whatever that looks like, have been kind of taken advantage of in this structure that we have in college sports, where a lot of people up top are making a lot of money, and the people that are actually doing the work, actually putting their bodies on the line every Saturday or every couple of days in college basketball, tend to be brunting the most of the effort. So I think this is a very necessary effort for the NCAA, for college football, for college basketball, for all of college sports, really. It's something that absolutely needed to happen. Now, the next couple of months are things that may need to happen, may not. There are a lot of decisions that could happen that could affect this sport greatly. There are a couple of decisions that likely don't need to be made, but might be made anyway. So it'll be fascinating to watch, is that private equity coming into the party, which I've said time and again is not my favorite thing in the world. Is it a couple of different, loans given out to some of these different schools to keep them afloat? Is it, these schools kind of folding in some different aspects of their athletic department? So there's a lot of things that are going to happen over the next year. But this was something that probably had to happen. Charlie Baker and his group had to get together and figure out what was the payment structure going to be going forward, because I think we can probably all agree that this is not the way that it's supposed to be. The NIL game where it's, who can write the biggest number, who can give you the fanciest car, whatever it is, it's not the way that college football, college sports are supposed to work. And the next couple of months are going to be just huge to figure out what is that structure, how should it work in this new future, because it's going to be different. And we don't really know what that is going to look like until we get down that road. But the reality is, we've taken that first big step, right? We've crossed the road of getting a settlement in place, knowing what that number is for them to split up, knowing that this is going to be the new future. Now it's about ironing out all the details, making sure that we get into this new thing and aren't shocked by what happens, because we're prepared for a lot of the different things that can happen. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch. It's one of those things where you get into this conversation and you start talking about NIL and all the different things going on in college football, and anything to put a cap on that, I think, is probably a good thing. Now, this is obviously a ton of things need to happen for all of this to go over smoothly and all of this to work the way that we want to, but the reality is this is a first big leap, and we probably needed to take that leap. Now, the next couple of steps are going to be absolutely huge for the NCAA, and if they stay a part of the party over here, but the reality is it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the next year. And I think college football, college basketball could be on their way out if it's not handled the way that they want it. So it'll be really interesting to see how that unfolds. I think one of the biggest things for the future is, who is the leader in all of this? Is it Charlie Baker that's kind of leading the way? Is it Greg Sankey or Tony Petitti kind of leading the way? Is it someone totally different? But we'll all figure that out in the next, month to a year, where there's going to be tons of stuff happening. There's going to be tons of, stones overturned, and there will be some worms under there, but sometimes it'll be the way that we need it to be, and it'll be very few consequences, and maybe it'll work perfectly. But this next year is going to be absolutely huge for the sport and for college sports in general. So we'll definitely break it down as it starts to happen. Obviously, a ton still to overturn there and to figure out what's the best way to go forward. But we'll keep you updated always. But we're going to take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Jim Harbaugh and Sherrone more. There's a ton going on at Michigan, but it sounds like Jim Harbaugh has his full support behind Sherrone Moore in more ways than we probably knew before today. But we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Charlie Baker, the NCAA president, and he had some comments on the House settlement that just got crossed, and definitely some more things to come. Well, let's just put it that way. Definitely some bridges to cross and some things to figure out before we're to a place where we all understand what's going on. But let's get into Sherrone Moore and Jim Harbaugh. And there was a very interesting thing that was done, I think, a couple of days ago. Joel Klatt had a very interesting conversation with Sherrone Moore around the Fox noon kickoff, kind of building up hype for that journey this upcoming season. And he had a very, very interesting conversation with him. And there were a number of things covered, how he handled last season as a interim head coach, how he's going to handle this season as a full-time head coach, his relationship with Jim Harbaugh, a ton of different things were covered. But the biggest thing that was taken out of this, at least in my opinion, was the fact that Jim Harbaugh essentially promised him the job. I don't essentially know exactly when this happened. I think probably sometime before last year or in the middle of last year, where Jim Harbaugh had said he put it in his contract that if he ever leaves to go somewhere else, that's your head coach. Sherrone Moore is absolutely your head coach, and that's just the way it was. So not only is that a remarkable thing to have happened, because I don't think it's ever really happened in this sport. Now, I'm not necessarily sure. There's definitely some very good relationships across the country that could have developed into this type of thing, but this is something that I haven't really seen, and it's something that is really, really fascinating because it adds to kind of the pressure that Sherrone Moore is feeling, which is already, massive. But when you have someone like Jim Harbaugh backing you the way that he did, where it's going to be in his contract, if you want him to sign that, he's going to have Sherrone Moore be the next head coach guaranteed. And that's a huge thing to take over. There's no two ways about that, where you have this legend of the game. You have a guy that's coached in a Super Bowl, that's won a national title, that's done tons of things at both levels of the sport. Say that is your next head coach. There's no two ways about it. Adds a little bit to what you have to deliver in your first year and how you kind of feel about this first year going in. Now, the fun thing for Sherrone Moore, I'm sure, is it feels like Michigan's not being talked about too much. Weirdly enough, it feels like the reigning champs, as much as you can't be talked about as the reigning champs, it feels like, Ohio State, Oregon, maybe even Penn State are dominating some of the conversation around the Big Ten, and then Michigan's just up there in Ann Arbor getting to work. They're just doing exactly what they've always done under Jim Harbaugh and now Sherrone Moore, and they're preparing for a season in pretty much silence, and it's very, very interesting. Obviously, this doesn't necessarily apply to Sherrone Moore. There's plenty of pressure, plenty of intensity around him, and he wants to prove Jim Harbaugh right. It's one of his, mentors throughout his career. It's one of the guys that he has one of the closest relationships in his life, I'm sure. So it's definitely something that he takes to heart. He wants to be the guy that showed Jim Harbaugh that he was absolutely correct to make him the next coach of Michigan, and was absolutely correct in all of the things that he said about him before that. So I think it's going to be really fascinating to see this unfold. It's obviously a newfound pressure for Sherrone Moore to deal with, and for Jim Harbaugh to kind of put that on him. But at the end of the day, this guy is as cool, calm, and collected as I've ever seen a new coach going into this situation. Him and Kalen DeBoer are taking over two situations where there's about as much pressure as you could possibly think, and they're both handling it really, really well up until this point. Sherrone Moore obviously has been a little bit more quiet because when Nick Saban leaves the sport, everyone's going to be watching you under a microscope, but he did say one of the things that he learned last year being a head coach was everyone's watching at all times. You can't make a wrong step. You can't yell at a kid in the wrong way on the sideline, or vice versa, let a kid off the hook the wrong way. There's tons of things that you have to make sure you're doing right as a head coach, that as an offensive coordinator, you have a little bit of leeway to kind of play around with stuff because you're not the face of the program. You're not the guy that's leading the guys out of the tunnel, but now he is, and it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. Apparently, he heard that Jim Harbaugh was taking the job at the Chargers in the Houston airport. Jim and him had talked over the couple of days leading up to this that this was a possibility and something that could happen. But he figured out in the Houston airport when he was heading to Dallas. As you can imagine, he was not heading to Dallas anymore. He headed back to Ann Arbor, interviewed for the job, got the job 2 days later, and then 2 days after that, he was on the road recruiting again. So this guy had to get back to work, and he knew that there was work to be done because when you look at what Ohio State has done this offseason, what Oregon did this offseason, what Penn State has been able to do, so you're fighting a hard battle this upcoming year. Probably a harder battle than Michigan fought a year ago in that conference, and probably one of the hardest that Jim Harbaugh would have had to fight as a head coach. So it would have been fascinating to see how he would have handled this, but we get to see how Sherrone Moore would handle it. And I think he's going to be a fantastic head coach. The dude just absolutely oozes confidence, someone that can really do anything you need him to do. Feels like kind of a chameleon and a big-time, riser in this industry, and someone that's kind of taken center stage, really. When you're the head coach of the reigning national title winners, it's going to be a lot of pressure. And especially when you're taking over for someone like Jim Harbaugh, there's going to be certain things that you're going to have to achieve. There's going to have to be a certain standard when they step on that field, and you're going to have to be the one leading that way. There's going to have to be a certain toughness and physicality from this team that has been there when Jim Harbaugh was there. There's going to have to be certain things that Michigan fans have gotten comfortable with. Let's be totally honest. They've beaten Ohio State 3 years in a row. They've gone to the playoff. They've done, excuse me, they've done just incredible things over the last couple of years, and Jim Harbaugh was the guy leading them there. So they absolutely love him. I don't think there's any ill will for him moving on, because it was something that I think a lot of us expected to happen throughout his time. But Sherrone Moore stepping in is going to be a lot of pressure. It's going to be a lot of things that he just has to do in his first year. Now, I'm not necessarily saying he has to go to the playoff, win a national title, do anything absolutely crazy, or even beat Ohio State and win the Big Ten. I don't think that's necessarily something that has to happen by any means. I think it's something that absolutely would help. There's no two ways about that. But I do think there's not necessarily this massive pressure to deliver a national title winner or deliver a playoff winner or something like that. But you got to show that you're still Michigan. You got to show that you still have that edge to you that Jim Harbaugh had and that those teams had. And if you don't, then Michigan fans are going to get pretty frustrated pretty quickly. Now, Sherrone Moore seems like the absolute guy to lead them there, and absolutely knows what the standard is, being around Jim Harbaugh as much as he was. But it's going to be a new battle for him. There's no two ways about that. He did have a bunch of really interesting things throughout this piece. He talked about the Penn State game where he coached his first game, got that first win, and apparently had to apologize to his mom and his grandmother when he cursed on national television afterwards. But that's something that I'll let him deal with on his time. But he also talked about the playoff game against Alabama and the drive that essentially won them that game when they went down and scored a touchdown with Roman Wilson to take a lead and never give it back. So he talked about kind of what went into that play. He said he knew that it was the biggest drive in Michigan history, and he wasn't really wrong. It was absolutely a huge drive for them and something that kind of cemented that team, where they went into the national title as the comfortable favorite. I think they were probably a bigger favorite than they were against Alabama. And that game, I felt like we all kind of knew when Michigan, if they were able to get through that game, they were probably your national title winners. If they were able to show up with a month of rest for a Nick Saban team and get that win, I think everyone felt pretty confident that they were going to go on and win that title. And he knew it as well, it sounds. So he put together an incredible drive. They went down and scored, obviously, with Roman Wilson scoring the touchdown. They had a 4th and 2 conversion on that where he called a great play for Blake Corum. So there's a tons of things that he's just done incredible jobs at, and he's been in so many different situations throughout his career. But this is one he hasn't. There's no two ways about that. He hasn't been the head guy at a place like Michigan. He hasn't, led the guys out of a tunnel with someone like Texas coming to town in week 2, or more importantly, Ohio State at the end of the year. So there's going to be some very interesting things that happen. Now, this is a very rock-solid program. They have a lot of things really going well for it, and they'll have a ton of things that are really just exactly the way that you need it if you're going to compete in the Big Ten. Now, there are some things he's going to have to deal with off the field, as we all know, that are not necessarily ideal with the different scandals and some of the cases and all the things that are surrounding Michigan football right now. Not all of them are great, but at the end of the day, he's one of those guys that's just very easy to root for. And it's because of that energy he brings. It's because of that confidence he brings in. It's because of what he's done on the football field as a head coach, and he's just done, or as a offensive coordinator, and likely will do as a head coach, frankly. He's just really, really a guy that is easy to root for. Definitely someone that can keep Michigan where they want to be, which is right at the top. So it's obviously a ton on his shoulders, especially with that promise that Jim Harbaugh made to him. But at the end of the day, this guy is as comfortable, as cool, calm, and collected as you possibly could be in this scenario, because he knows what he has. He has a really, really good team with a ton of big-time leadership positions on that team where guys are stepping up, whether it's Donovan Edwards, whether it's Mason Graham, Will Johnson, whoever that looks like. He knows he has a foundation in that program that was built by the guy before him, and he wants to use that and, build it even further and prove him right by putting that in his contract. You want to be the guy that no one regrets hiring, essentially, is the big mantra in this sport. You never want to be the guy that is kicked out the door and they realize, that was the wrong decision. Especially Jim Harbaugh, someone that he cares about so much. He wants to prove him right. And frankly, I think he's going to. I think it might take some time, but the weight of the world is on this guy's shoulders, but he seems very cool, calm, and collected during it. So it'll be really interesting to see that unfold. But we're going to take our next break here, and when we come back, We're going to talk about some of the Big Ten win totals. Then we'll get into some Big Ten Cinderellas. So tons to get to over the next couple of segments. But stick with us, and we'll be right back after that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Jim Harbaugh and the promise that he made to Sherrone Moore. He put it in his contract that Sherrone Moore was going to be the next head coach of Michigan football after he found his way off to whatever the next chapter was. And that is a ton of pressure to put on Sherrone Moore, but he seems to be handling it more than fine. But let's jump into Big 12 win totals. There's a ton of stuff to break down. We have a couple of teams that I think are just a little bit too high, some teams that I think are a little bit too low, some teams that I think are absolutely perfect. But this is going to be a fascinating conference. Frankly, it's the conference that I like the most going into this season because I think there's going to be so many interesting things to pull out of it, and it's going to be a really hard fight to get to Arlington at the end of the year. But there's a couple of teams up top that are dominating conversation, and they should be. It's Utah and it's Kansas State. These teams are the class of the league. There's no two ways about it. I think these teams are absolutely going to be the ones setting the pace. They have the quarterbacks that kind of set the pace for the conference in Cam Rising and Avery Johnson. Obviously, Shedeur Sanders is kind of his own special example where the team around him is not necessarily what you want, but is still a very talented player. But you have Avery Johnson and Dylan Edwards at Kansas State is going to be one of the most electrifying duos in the entire country. There's no two ways about that. Utah is as steady as possible. When Kyle Whittingham is there, they're going to win a lot of football games and possibly even win a conference or two. So definitely a really, really good team. Both teams are the teams currently I expect to be in Arlington. I haven't made a pick yet. I probably won't make a pick until August, but definitely the teams that, as of right now, stand out in my mind. And then you got Kansas at 8.5 wins. Definitely a really interesting team. Jalen Daniels is one of the most under-talked about guys in the entire country. When he is healthy, this team wins a ton of games. They started 5-0, I believe, in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, before he got injured. Last year, he had some injury troubles as well, but when he's on the field, they're a totally different team. Now, he's got to stay on the field, and that's a huge if for him, but he's a really, really talented player, and I really hope that he stays healthy because he's one of my favorite players in the entire country. And then you have Devin Neal, you have a trio of receivers. That offense is going to be really, really solid. The floor is super high, and then the ceiling is obviously remarkably high with the talent that they have in that room. But when you have Devin Neal, when you have the three wide receivers that they have, when you have a guy like Jalen Daniels that has run that offense to a very high clip, you're going to be good. You're going to at least be good. You're going to at least score some points. Now, if they can hit a ceiling, then it's going to get really interesting in Lawrence. But we'll definitely break that down as the season goes on. But the 7.5 is where the huge, massive teams is. And that's likely where the conference will be decided, is these 7.5 teams maybe pulling an upset, maybe making a run, maybe a dark horse team in this bunch. But Arizona is the biggest unknown in my eyes in this conference, where you have Noah Fafita, you have Tatori McMillan, and I absolutely love that duo, one of the best quarterback wide receiver duos in the entire country, but you lose Jed Fish. You're bringing in Brent Brennan, who is going to take over a team that is a lot bigger than the team he's coming from in San Jose State. He did a great job over there, but it's going to be a huge question mark of, is this team what it needs to be in a new conference? And you lose guys like Bill Norton and Jonah Coleman to the transfer portal, it gets that much harder. So it'll be fascinating to watch how that team develops. I think they're a really good team, but as of right now, I just don't fully know what to expect from them. And then you have Iowa State, one of the most, maybe the most experienced team in the entire country. Rocco Becht coming back, and he wants his respect. He's playing really, really good football, has been for the past couple of years at Iowa State, but I think he's ready to take that step forward and be not only a really good quarterback for Iowa State, but be one of the best quarterbacks in the conference and maybe, just maybe, get to a conference title game. I know a lot of people are picking them to be kind of the dark horse of the bunch, but definitely a really interesting team. Matt Campbell, this team feels like the one that's kind of that 2020 type roster where you have a ton of talent, you have a ton of experience coming back, and Matt Campbell did incredible things with that roster when he took them to the Big 12 championship. So it'll be interesting to see that team develop. You have Oklahoma State there as well, a very experienced team as well there. Ollie Gordon is what you can expect for this team. They are going to ride that guy the same way they did last year, where he's going to be the entirety of the offense in a lot of ways. In some ways, it's a really good thing because this O-line is absolutely incredible. That's one of the big reasons that they're going to be running it so much. And then you have TCU. They're kind of in an interesting spot this upcoming year. If Josh Hoover can kind of unlock whatever Max Duggan found at TCU in 2022, they could have a huge year. And Sonny Dykes could get himself back into that conversation where I think this is going to be a huge year for him. He's got to prove that 2022 wasn't a flash in the pan. It was actually who they are going forward, and they're going to be a contender in this conference going forward. So it's a huge year for them. Definitely will be very interesting to see that team unfold. And then you have Texas Tech, one of my favorite teams in the entire country, if I'm being honest. You have Bear Morton, who has a ton of confidence in that offense at this point. Between Micah Hudson, Josh Kelly, Caleb Douglas, and many more, you have plenty of guys to throw to. Definitely will be a very fun offense to watch. And then you have Taj Brooks, who is always dangerous. Definitely someone who's one of the best running backs in the entire country. So definitely going to give this offense a very, very interesting kind of dynamic on the ground and through the air this upcoming year. And then you have UCF, who essentially poured in an entirely new squad, but it's a really good one. You have KJ Jefferson, you have Penny Boone, Javarius Johnson, Nigel Kelly, and RJ Harvey is the only one that was there a year ago. So all of those guys are going to be huge players for them. Definitely will be massive for this team's success. But then you get down to the bottom half of the conference. You have West Virginia at 6.5 wins. This is a team that I think is going to be really, really interesting. They're getting some love after what they had in 2023, which was a really good year. Garrett Green is a huge reason for all that love because he plays the game the exact way that you want to. It's kind of that, level of swagger, intensity that he brings is going to be a huge, huge chip for them going into this season. And then you have Jaheim White, one of the most interesting players in the conference. Definitely a really good running back. Could make some noise for an all Big 12 team. Definitely a really talented guy that's kind of just hitting what he could do in this league. And then you have the 5.5 guys. You have Baylor, Cincinnati, Colorado, 3 teams that are kind of in weird spots. Baylor feels like a program going in the wrong direction, if I'm being totally honest. You have Dave Aranda there, and I really like him. I think he's a very good coach. But since that big-time season that they had, it's kind of been slowly reeling back, and it's not necessarily what you want to see. Now, you did bring in Daquan Finn, who's one of my favorite players in the entire country, so I do like this team a little bit, but Baylor over the last couple of years has not necessarily inspired a lot of confidence in their fan base, I suppose. And then you have Cincinnati with Brendan Sorsby. Bringing him in is absolutely huge. Dante Corleone is another really fun player to watch for them on the defensive line, but I don't know. This team is going to probably be towards the bottom of the conference, at least until further notice. Scott Satterfield feels like he's starting to set his feet, maybe get this thing moving, but it's still going to be tough. And then you have the best reality TV show in college football, the Colorado Buffaloes. Will definitely be a very interesting team this upcoming year. Has a lot of promises that were made by Dion and company about what they can do and what they will do this upcoming year. Will they? I don't know. But I know there are a lot of people that love the over. I would maybe lean that way, but I wouldn't touch it, if I'm being totally honest. And then you have the 4.5 boys. You have Arizona State, BYU, and Houston. Arizona State feels like a program that's just kind of revving their engine. They have every ability to put it into gear and to get moving. And Kenny Dillingham is one of those guys that I really, really like as a head coach, but they need to put it into gear. They need a spark plug. They need something to happen this upcoming year, whether it's beating Arizona maybe, or beating Utah, or beating one of these big-time teams in the conference. It'll be interesting to see what this team can do. And then you have Boise State, who I think could make some noise. Definitely a very interesting team, bringing in Jerry Bohannon, but it's going to be a tough road. There's no two ways about that. Provo's not the easiest place to play, so maybe they spring an upset there, but they're definitely fighting an uphill battle with a lot of these teams just being more talented and more deep than they are. And then you have Houston. I think they just need a couple of big moments this year. Beat one big team on national television, show the people that Willie Fritz at least has it somewhat rolling over there, and then you can really get going. And I think it'll be a really good team in time, but they're going to really definitely have to buckle down and at least get one big time upset this upcoming year. But let's get into too high, too low, and on the money. I think TCU and Cincinnati are just a little bit too high. I don't love this TCU team. I think there's too much moving parts for that team to really be successful in this conference this upcoming year. I think Josh Hoover is a good player. I don't think he stacks up to the other quarterbacks in this conference. So I don't necessarily love where TCU's at. I think there might be a reality where 2022 was kind of a flash in the pan type season, and everything is kind of stagnant from now on. But we'll see what happens. And then you have Cincinnati. I just don't love this team. I think they're fighting a real uphill battle with all of the other people around him. They don't necessarily have the experience or the talent to go along with it. So I don't know. It doesn't seem like they're necessarily going to be in a position where they're going to be able to really make a lot of noise this year. Then you have the two low teams. I think Oklahoma State is definitely too low. They return so much experience. They have one of the highest floors in the entire country, in my opinion. Can do some really, really incredible things this year. Alan Bowman coming back, Ollie Gordon back, most of the wide receivers back, all of the O-line back. There's tons of things they can do, and I think they get to 8 wins pretty comfortably, honestly. And then you have West Virginia at 6.5. They're building something over there. There's no two ways about that. I feel like Neil Brown finally set his feet, knew exactly what they were going to do, and Garrett Green is a huge reason they're moving forward as quickly as they are. So they'll be really interesting to watch. And then I have Baylor a little bit too low, and this is really just because I love Daquan Finn. I think he is an entire offense by himself. He can do some really, really incredible things that I think will definitely help this team. And then when you have Dave Aranda calling the defense, you're going to be pretty successful. And I think he has enough experience there to where they're going to be able to be much better than they were a year ago. And then everyone else I think is pretty much on the money. You could argue Arizona or Colorado is a little too low. You could argue Kansas or UCF might be a touch high. But at the end of the day, I think most of those numbers are pretty much on the money. But all of these are going to be all over the place because it's one of my favorite conferences in the country. But with that comes a lot of very weird things that are going to happen. There's no two ways about that. So we'll definitely break that down throughout the season, give you guys an update on how the Big 12 is going. But for now, we'll take our third break, and when we come back, we're going to do Big 12 Cinderellas. We have a couple of teams that I want you guys to watch that'll be really interesting this upcoming season. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did Big 12 win totals, gave you some teams that I think might be a little bit too high, a little bit too low, and the other teams just on the money. But we'll get into Cinderella Watch now. Definitely some Big 12 teams. It feels like the Big 12, it might just have none in terms of Cinderellas because I don't know if there's a dark horse team. I don't know if there's a team that you don't have to watch in this upcoming season because there's probably about 10 or 11 that can win this conference realistically. So these are teams that are a little bit off the beaten path, but definitely teams that absolutely could make some noise. Everyone seems to be going towards Iowa State in this conference when they're talking about Cinderellas or dark horses. So I went a little bit different direction. I do agree with them. I do think that is going to be a fantastic team up there for Matt Campbell, but I didn't want to, add one of those teams into the heap and hear the same thing that you've heard, I'm sure, from a number of people when they talk about Iowa State. But I'll give you my two teams here, and it starts with the UCF Black Knights. I think this team is fascinating. When you go into this year, Gus Malzahn has something cooking down in Orlando. I can almost promise you that. The talent level and the juice on this team is much bigger than it has been in past years. And it feels like it's somewhere close to what that 2017 team had, where you get kind of close to that. I don't know. It feels like the fan base down there is just more excited for UCF football than they have been in quite some time. Now, can they pull off the same feat? Probably not, but they absolutely can take the Big 12 by storm and do some really incredible things this year. KJ Jefferson is kind of the key to this, definitely will be a huge player for them. I like to call him the great value Cam Newton. I know that sounds mean, but I promise you it's not, because that's still a really good player. Cam Newton was one of the best, maybe the best player that I've ever seen in college football, so even if KJ Jefferson is the Walgreens brand of him, he's going to be really good. And they have a running back duo right next to him that's going to be just as good. You have RJ Harvey, you have Penny Boone, both guys that are just going to be incredible. Penny Boone kind of fell into their lap after some academic troubles, got him into a little bit of not a hairy situation. It just didn't get him into Kentucky the way that he wanted to. So he came on down to UCF and did absolutely help this team take that next step and have one of the best duos in the entire country at the running back room. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. I think the O-line has been shuffling around a little bit to figure out what the right five is and where they fit, but it sounds like they found it. It sounds like there's definitely a little bit of a consensus of what the five guys are, where they're going to set up, and how they're going to go into this season. So as long as they can hold up and be at least solid, it's going to be a heavy run game. So they're going to be a lot of quarterback runs with KJ Jefferson. There's going to be a lot of read options, a lot of things where you have to hit the point of attack and get some push. And so if they can't do that, then it could be kind of a long year for them. Now, the wide receiver group is really solid, so they're going to be able to throw the ball just a little bit. KJ Jefferson is not necessarily the most prolific passer in the world, but definitely has ability. You add Javarius Johnson from Auburn, absolutely a huge pickup. You have Kobe Hudson and Xavier Townsend coming back from a year ago, both really solid players. So definitely going to make life a little bit easier on KJ Jefferson. They're definitely going to have to put him in the right situations, because he's not a guy that's going to put balls into really tight windows or do absolutely incredible things in the passing game, but he can be really good, and he can be really competent and open up those running lanes, which is really where UCF is going to do the majority of their damage this upcoming year. And then the portal really affected their defense more than really anywhere else, where you have essentially living and dying by some of these portal additions. None are bigger than Nigel Kelly coming over from Miami, an absolutely huge player for them. They need a pass rush on this team if they're going to be a big-time player in the Big 12, where you have pass rushers all over the field. So that guy right there, Nigel Kelly, is going to be huge for them. He's going to have to make plays pretty much right away. Coming over from Miami in the spring portal cycle was absolutely huge for them. And then you have guys like Traquan Fagans. You have Sheldon Arnold in the back end, who I think is a really, really interesting player. I think he's coming over from East Tennessee State. Definitely someone that I could see on an all Big 12 team at the end of the year, because he's really, really talented. He's just coming from a little bit smaller of a school. So maybe it'll be a little bit of an adjustment period, but the kid can play football. There's no two ways about that. I think this UCF team is one of those teams that you look at it and it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily jump off the page from a roster perspective or isn't necessarily anything crazy, but it feels like with Gus Malzahn steering the ship, calling the plays, doing the things that he maybe was able to do with Cam Newton. KJ Jefferson's not going to be able to do all those things. I can almost promise you that, but he can run a similar offense, and I think that's what he wants to run. And it'll be fascinating to see if it works as well as it did in 2010. But at the end of the day, this UCF team is a team that absolutely can make some noise in this conference. I think they can compete with essentially anyone in this conference. When someone has to come to them, they're making a little bit longer of travel than they're probably used to, which definitely helps them out a little bit. So it'll be fascinating to watch. I think UCF is ready to kind of play spoilers, be a team that maybe wins 9-10 games, takes the world by storm, and maybe makes it to Arlington at the end of the year. So it'll be fascinating to watch that team unfold. But the other team that I'm watching is a very interesting team to me, one of the most fascinating teams in the country to me, and that's the Texas Tech Red Raiders. I think when you look at this team going into this season, after last season, there's not necessarily a lot of confidence, it feels like. It feels like there's a lot of people questioning what Joey McGuire is doing down there. I don't think there's Texas Tech fans, but I think from an outside perspective, there are definitely some people asking some questions about what the future holds for that program and how they're going to move forward after a lot of energy going into last year and then kind of not necessarily having the year that they wanted. But it feels like they're in better footing this upcoming year. This offense really starts and ends with that guy right there, Taj Brooks. He's going to be one of the best running backs in the country behind a really solid O-line that is shuffling around just a little bit. I think there's still kind of a lingering battle at left guard, but I think it's going to be a good group. They return, I believe, 3 starters on that offensive line, so plenty of guys to work with. The wide receiver group, I think, is going to be much better as well, which obviously helps out the run game. You have guys like Caleb Douglas, Josh Kelly, Coy Eakin, all really, really good players. Likely will be the starters, at least to start the season. But I think Micah Hudson is the guy for this team. I think if he takes the steps forward that they're expecting him to take, or if he, jumps onto the scene as a freshman the way that they're expecting him, he absolutely is going to be a difference maker for this team and could take this offense to kind of that next level that maybe some people don't think they're capable of unlocking. But I think they're going to be a really good team. I think Joey McGuire brings a certain level of intensity and identity to this team that they've been missing at least a little bit over the past, couple of head coaches. And I think with Joey McGuire, it is no confusion about where he wants to be, the way he wants to go about business. And I think it's the exact way that Texas Tech should be going about business. So I think it's going to be a really interesting team. The defense returns a ton of experience. Did portal in a ton of guys last year with the 2023 class, but pretty much has sat pat this last year. Definitely brought in a couple of guys here and there, but a lot of guys are just returning for their second year from the portal to Texas Tech. So definitely a lot of experience on this team. I think it'll be really good. CJ Baskerville is the guy that I'm watching probably most closely because he's going to have to be huge for this team. He came over from LSU in the 2023 offseason. Definitely could be a hugely important player for them and kind of build everyone out around them. Definitely a team that I'm watching very, very closely. Yeah, exactly. I think Texas Tech absolutely has the ability to have a breakout year. They're a really interesting team. They have Amarian Banks on the front line is going to be a really good defensive lineman right next to Quincy Ledette. So I think the duo is really going to be solid, and they're going to be able to do a lot of things correctly. Where in the Big 12, when there's so much variability and there's so many teams that can make some noise, you'll find that the teams that just make the fewest mistakes, the teams that have some of that experience that you need, the teams that do things the same way every single day are likely the teams that are going to end up coming out of this conference. I feel confident that Utah's going to do that. I feel pretty confident that Oklahoma State's going to do that. I think Texas Tech is absolutely going to do that as well. And I think it comes back to the leader that they have. I think Joey McGuire is the perfect person to be the head coach of Texas Tech. And I think he has the ability to take this team where they haven't been in quite some time, which is at the very top of the Big 12. So definitely we'll be watching that team very closely. Obviously, I do think Iowa State is a team to watch in here. There are definitely some other teams in this conference with probably 10 or 11 teams that can win this conference, so there's going to be a lot of teams to watch for sure. But we're going to take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to get into a new segment we have around here called Wednesday What Ifs. We're going to get into a couple around players, coaches from the past, the present, the future, whatever that looks like. Definitely will be a very fun segment for us going forward, but love the Big 12, love what they're bringing to the table. Definitely will be a very, very fun conference to break down throughout the year, and definitely will be just my favorite conference in the country for sure. But we'll break down Wednesday What Ifs right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some Cinderellas possibly in the Big 12. I talked about UCF and Texas Tech, two teams that I think could make some real big noise this upcoming year. But let's get into Wednesday What Ifs, kind of a new segment around here. I want to break down some different what ifs from the past, the present, the future, about players, about coaches, about teams, whatever you want. Definitely submit anything you want in the comments here that I'll break down following weeks in the next coming weeks here. But let's start to break this down. And the first what if I have is about Joe Burrow. And my question here is, what if he never broke his hand in 2017? I know this is a very, very ineffectual thing to be talking about, but it has huge, wide-ranging effects where there is a hypothetical world where Joe Burrow is their starter in 2018. He was in a battle with Dwayne Haskins for that backup spot in 2017 and then broke his hand. They were going to be the backup to JT Barrett, and they ended up being. But it ended up being Dwayne Haskins instead of Joe Burrow because of that broken hand. It kept him out of being able to throw for quite a long time. Dwayne Haskins took that leap, was the backup that year, and then took over in 2018 and absolutely lit the world on fire and did incredible things. So it would be really interesting, right? If Joe Burrow never broken his hand, he was the backup for JT Barrett and got into some more games in 2017, and then in 2018 was the starter for Ohio State. He never finds his way to LSU, and he never has that record-breaking season in 2019. Now, that doesn't mean he wasn't going to be a top draft pick and wasn't going to do incredible things at the college level, but it does mean it wasn't going to be an LSU uniform, and that would have been really fascinating to watch. I think when we think about Joe Burrow and what he did in college football, we always think about LSU. I think forever we're going to think about that guy right there. We're going to think about the guy that led LSU to one of the most remarkable seasons that I've ever seen, probably one of the most remarkable seasons that a lot of you have ever seen in this sport. So definitely a really, really interesting hypothetical where maybe Joe Burrow is a Ohio State legend and only Ohio State legend. I know there's a little bit of a fight between those fan bases about which one he actually identifies with, which one he actually is. I tend to think it's both. I don't think there needs to be some type of battle over a quarterback, but at the end of the day, when we think about Joe Burrow, that's probably not the guy that you're thinking of. You're thinking of the LSU guy, you're thinking of the Bengals guy at this point, but it would be fascinating if he never broke that hand, if he maybe was never the third string in that 2017 year. He was the backup, was the starter in 2018, and then Dwayne Haskins, the incredible player that he was, the incredible season that he had might have been just a season later, or might have been for a different team. So a ton of different wide-ranging effects. Maybe he's still at the same spot. Maybe he's still a top quarterback drafted. Maybe he's still the starting quarterback for one of these top teams, but he would have been Ohio State quarterback for at least his time in college football, and it would have been fascinating to see that unfold. But one of the other interesting things that I wanted to break down is kind of a what if that is unfolding kind of before our eyes. What if Jim Harbaugh never left for the NFL? I think that's a very interesting conversation that probably a lot of you have had throughout the season, where we were likely expecting him to walk off to the NFL at some point. The Connor Stallions case, recruiting violations, all that stuff kind of pushed him in that direction, but there was a reality where he found his way back to Michigan. And that would have been a very interesting one. You're coming off a national title. We talked about what Sherrone Moore is dealing with. I can only imagine what this program would be dealing with if Jim Harbaugh was still there. There would still be a ton of conversation around Connor Stallions and around the recruiting violations and all of that stuff. There would be a ton of more eyes and kind of rooting on the downfall of Michigan in a lot of ways. So this would be fascinating to watch. I think Harbaugh would be the talk of the country. You wouldn't be talking about Ohio State or Georgia or Texas or Oregon. You'd be talking about him because he'd done something that he'd kind of been building up for in quite some time. He had a couple of years at Michigan where it looked like he might not be the coach at Michigan going forward, but he was able to battle through, win a national title, get to that top level, and then he walked away. But if he hadn't walked away, this Michigan team would be the talk of college football. I have no doubts about that. There would be plenty of free Harbaugh signs around Ann Arbor, around the entire country. When we talk about kind of what would happen in the recruiting violations, and the Connor Stallions one especially would be a huge topic of conversation. And I think on top of all of that, the staff would be essentially the same. There wouldn't be this big time turnover to talk about, at least from a staff perspective. There still would be that for the roster, but it would be interesting to see kind of how this would develop and how this team would feel going into the season. I think there would be definitely a little bit more confidence, although I don't think they lost much when Sherrone Moore took over. But I do think it would be a very interesting conversation off the field, where you're probably going to have a very good team regardless. But off the field, there was going to be a lot of conversation around Michigan and, what that season meant. And is there an asterisk next to it because of Connor Stallions? And there would be a lot of conversations that would happen that I think would be very interesting, at least to see unfold. It would definitely be not necessarily talking about football too much, more talking about the outside world, but it would be fascinating to see that unfold. Definitely something that I'm definitely watching going forward. But the final one I have for you is, What if Oregon or Ole Miss wins the national title? I know that sounds not that far-fetched. Both these teams have the ability to do that, but this one is going to be really, really fun to watch because it not only has, effects of who's the next big-time coach, where I don't know if anyone else has this feeling, but I have this feeling that whoever wins the national title this upcoming year, that head coach is the number 2 coach in the country. I think Dabo Swinney right now I would put at number 2, but I have big time questions about what he's doing right this second at Clemson. And I think whether it's Lane Kiffin or it's Dan Lanning or maybe it's Steve Sarkisian or maybe it's Kalen DeBoer over at Alabama, whoever that is, whoever wins the title or maybe loses to Georgia in the national title, maybe it's Ohio State and Ryan Day, it feels like that guy's going to be the number 2 head coach in the country. And it feels like that team is going to be looked at as the next big time team in the country. So whether it's, Oregon or it's Ole Miss, one of these teams is going to be able to make some noise. And if they do, it would flip everything on its head, from the powers that be in those conferences where Ohio State and Michigan would have to watch a team that just walked into the conference walk right past them to a conference title and a national title. And then you have the SEC, Ole Miss having passed up Bama and Georgia in one offseason with a massive transfer portal class. It would start some conversations. And I think the roster construction would be a very interesting thing to watch going forward, where maybe they lean more into the portal. Maybe they do kind of the Ole Miss way of things, where you essentially just rebuild a side of the ball entirely in the portal, where you add guys like Walter Nolan, Princely Emmanuel, and Chris Paul Jr., a ton of really talented guys that came over. But if you can turn that into a national championship team, which, to be fair, people haven't been able to do in the past, but there's more chances this year than there ever have been. And these two teams are absolutely the ones that are setting the pace the most in that category. And I think Dan Lanning could be, the second best head coach in the country and flip over the entire roster construction of college football. Now, I think Oregon's a little bit different from Ole Miss because they have been recruiting at such a high clip and have built such a good foundation that the portal class is not necessarily as, much of the team as in Oregon as it is in Ole Miss. Ole Miss added essentially everyone from the portal. They added so many big-time players. Now, Jackson Dart coming back is absolutely huge for them, and definitely not a position that they wanted to add from the portal, but it'll be fascinating to watch both these teams. I think when you look at both these teams, they have the ability to pull this off. They have the ability to win the conference, to go to the playoff, to win a national title, and if all that happens, a lot of dominoes start to fall in terms of how those conferences are constructed going forward, as how those head coaches are looked at in the world of college football, and on top of all of that, how roster construction maybe works going forward in college football. So these are the two teams that I'm watching the closest going into this year, where they can flip college football on its head, not only on the field but off the field, and it'll be fascinating to watch if they're able to do that. So if you have the foundation, if you have the ability to add a ton of players in the portal and not miss a step, there's going to be teams that look that direction, including Georgia, Texas, Alabama, some of these teams that have been a little bit more not resistant to the portal, but haven't used it quite as much as some other entities out there like Ole Miss and Oregon. So it'll be fascinating to watch if either of these teams can, make it to the playoff, make it to the national title. Maybe they face off against each other, and then we have a big time conversation to be had. But at the end of the day, it's going to be really interesting to watch that unfold. I think when you talk about this year, there's tons of stuff that can happen both on the field that affects the on-the-field product, but also what happens with roster construction, what happens with these conferences going forward, media deals. There's a million things that will be affected, but roster construction to me is the biggest thing with these two teams. It'll be totally flipped on its head if both these teams, or one of these teams at least, can hoist that trophy at the end of the year. But as of right now, we are going to end it out for today. That'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are presented, obviously, by GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a ton to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content updates you could possibly need. We have incredible people doing really, really good work across every single sport you could possibly want, whether it's basketball, baseball, golf, hockey, women's sports. It does not matter. We definitely have you covered over here at GSMC, so definitely come on over and take in everything that we have to offer for you. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.